There's an analogy that is sometimes used: two wolves and a sheep voting on what's for dinner is not a fair vote. But that is what pure democracy is. And in pure democracies, even very large, significant minority groups can be ignored or tyrannized. So they set out to create something quite different. And they spent months discussing this. What are we going to do? And finally, they came to this conclusion that we are going to take the best aspects of democracy, because it's important for the people to have a say in their own government, but we're going to combine it with other sorts of checks and balances. We're going to create a republic.
Everybody knows that we cast a ballot every November, every 4 years, but we're not really voting for the president. We're voting for people as part of this so-called Electoral College. The three problems that people commonly today think plague the Electoral College is one, the one we've already identified, which is the person who gets fewer votes still wins. And what that means is everyone's vote doesn't count equally. By definition, if I get more votes than you, or let's put it the other way around, if you get more votes than me, and I somehow win the election, that means every one of your voters had less say than every one of my voters. My voters had more power per person than yours, because if every vote counted equally, then the person who gets the most votes would win.
So where does a national popular vote movement stand right now? At this moment, the compact has had enough states sign that they control 160 electoral votes or more. Hi, I'm Mary Owens with On Point. Welcome as we continue this process of understanding national popular vote versus the Electoral College.
As we've seen twice now in the past 16 years, the candidate who won the most votes among the popular electorate nationwide lost the Electoral College. So in 2000, Al Gore got more votes than George Bush nationwide among the electorate, but George Bush got more Electoral College votes, and therefore he became president. And the same thing happened just this last year when Hillary Clinton had more votes than Donald Trump nationwide among the voters, but Donald Trump won the Electoral College. So the key is every state can give its electors to whomever it chooses. Right now, every state gives its whole bucket of electors to the person, the candidate, who wins the most votes in that state.
Yes.
But states could say, if they wanted, hey, we will give our electors to the person who wins the most votes nationwide rather than in our state. So California could say, and in fact it has said, it will give its electors to the person who wins the most votes in the country, provided other states decide to do the same thing. And as long as enough states have made a commitment or an agreement to give their electors to the nationwide vote winner, then that will effectively guarantee that the nationwide vote winner will win the Electoral College as well. So that's the movement that has been adopted in 11 states, counting the District of Columbia,
right,
that make up 165 of the 270 electors needed to win the White House.
So to get clarity, these states that have adopted this compact, right now they comprise 165 of the electoral votes within the Electoral College.
And you need 270 to become president.
Yes.
They are trying to get states to agree to sign a contract, an interstate compact, among states where they say, we will give our electors to the winner of the national popular vote, not to the winner of the state popular vote. So the contract does not go into effect until they have had states holding 270 electors, which is a majority,
yes,
sign on. So they have had to date 10 states plus DC sign this contract. That's 165 electors among those states. And if they get 105 more, that will be 270, and the contract will go into effect. And so the next election after that, at least allegedly, the states say that they will give their electors to the winner of the national popular vote.
And national popular vote, if adopted, would be probably a stepping stone towards ultimately eliminating this antiquated group of people whose names we don't even know, called the Electoral College. People who make up the Electoral College are not particularly accomplished or particularly well known. They tend to be party functionaries who each political party just lists as its folks who are going to be casting the ballots. So the real reason national popular vote doesn't go ahead and eliminate the Electoral College altogether is to do that, you need a constitutional amendment.
Yes, and that's exactly where I'm going. What do you think is the likelihood that that could occur?
It's very hard to get a constitutional amendment because you need 3/4 of the states to sign on. And there are a number of states that benefit from the Electoral College system, even if majority of states don't. So for example, if I'm Ohio, why would I ever want to give up the Electoral College? I'm king of the world in Ohio. The candidates come every year. And so if I'm one of those swing states where all the attention is paid, I love the Electoral College. If I'm Texas, or if I'm New York, or if I'm California, the Electoral College is hurting me because my voice doesn't count. My candidates don't pay any attention to New York, Texas, or California. So you can't get a constitutional amendment because it's hard to get 3/4, but you can. That's the beauty of the National Popular Vote plan, is you don't need 3/4 of the states. You just need states that make up a majority of the Electoral College.
Does it bypass the Constitution and the Electoral College process? Do you anticipate, if there were enough states that signed on and they were way past the 270,
Yeah.
do you believe this will end up in the Supreme Court?
You know, we live in a world where people sue over everything. There's not a particularly credible argument that this bypasses the Constitution in any problematic way. I mean, tons of things over history. Let me give you an example. At the founding, the Constitution said the state legislatures elect U.S. senators. People don't elect senators directly. State legislatures did, okay? States started electing their senators through popular vote. The people of various states passed initiatives that basically told the state legislature, you must elect as senator the people we select as senator, otherwise you lose your seat in the state legislature. And that's how the Senate was elected for years before we had the 17th Amendment. So Article 2 of the Constitution says explicitly, every state can allocate its electors however it wants. So if enough states decide, hey, we want to allocate our electors to the person who wins the national popular vote because we think that's the best thing for the country, there's not a serious constitutional challenge to that. The bigger problem with the national popular vote is a logistical problem of, okay, do you have a nationally uniform ballot? Are you tallying votes in a correct way? What if one state doesn't want to participate? How do you work around that? Those are the issues that Congress will have to address if enough states join the compact.
Now, let's talk about the constitutionality of this. Is this a constitutional issue that could end up being challenged in the Supreme Court?
Oh, I think it would definitely be challenged for so many reasons. Not just, I think the other thing that's really important here is that a constitutional amendment, which is the correct way to get rid of the Electoral College, assuming you wanted to, which I don't, but if you wanted to, would be to go through the Article 5 amendment process, which requires 3/4 of the states to approve this. Now, this national popular vote legislation could be approved with as few as 11 states if they got the 11 biggest states to do it, which is why they're trying to use this method, right? Because if they pass this legislation using a contract instead of a constitutional amendment, then, I mean, how much easier is it to get even 18, 19 states on board than to get 38?
So in some essence, they're going around the constitutional process.
They're definitely going around the constitutional amendment process. And you don't hear them say this as much lately, but in the beginning, you could catch them saying things like they really felt like this is eventually going to end up in a constitutional amendment to get rid of the Electoral College. They're just pushing it along that close.
In a different methodology.
They are doing this because it is practical and it is easier to get a bunch of so far, blue states to approve this legislation, doing an end run around the process, than it is to get 3/4 of the states to approve an Article 5 amendment to get rid of the Electoral College. There are so many problems with this legislation. We're going to just hit the tip of the iceberg here. It's going to be very hard to hit it all. The legislation allows states to pull out, I believe it's in July 20th of any given presidential election year. And then allegedly there's a ban that you can't pull out for 6 months afterwards. And then you're allowed to pull out again after that. And that's their attempt at trying to maintain consistency in the process. Now, in reality, states are sovereign entities, and it's not clear that you can bind them that way, which is why I said if California is being forced to give its electors to George W. Bush, they're much more likely to see the writing on the wall in the day before the election to say, oh no, we pull out of this compact. We're not going to do this. We cannot be bound. The Constitution trumps this contract, whatever they're going to say. And the end result is going to be instability, because we're going to be going back and forth, not knowing which presidential election system are we operating under. You know, it's a very, I think, insecure place to be with this contract in effect. I do not want to get rid of the Electoral College, but I would much prefer a constitutional amendment, at least from that perspective, that we would all just know these are the rules, these are staying the rules, and this is the way it's going to be. They are creating a chaotic situation with, first of all, states can pop in and out. I'm not sure that they can be bound by some contractual provision. But two, even if they can be, you've got a situation where you have 51 different sets of laws governing this election, because every state has its own laws. So, you know, different rules about early voting, different rules about how to get on the ballot, different rules about whether felons can vote.
Yes.
There's a whole mess of rules, and that's fine. Now, so I live in Texas. That's fine if I'm voting in Texas election and we're casting ballots with other Texans to decide who the Texas electors are going to be. I don't care what the rules are in Michigan. It doesn't affect me. It doesn't affect my vote. It doesn't affect who my electors are going to be. But if the national popular vote legislation is in effect, then what happens is all of a sudden the fact that Michigan people on the other political party, I won't say one,
Yes.
that they got more time to early vote than I did, that matters to me, because now they are in the same election pool I am, and their vote will change the identity of a Texas elector. So that is a very different situation. And that is its own mess of lawsuits, because then there'll be lawsuits. There'll be equal protection lawsuits saying that's unconstitutional. You can't do that. You can't have different sets of rules applying to different voters who are all in the same election. That's a very basic democratic principle that we're supposed to agree on. So the national popular vote legislation, and I'll say they know that, and if you read some of what they've written, they admit it and concede it. But they think the answer is going to be that eventually there will be a new federal election bureaucracy that will come out of this.
And if enough states did join the compact, and now that issue was the primary issue when it came to electing a president, I could see potential delays in figuring out who is going to be the president because of the, as you say, people sue for everything, and they challenge the way the votes were counted. How would we avoid the problem of the immense delays because of the way various states differently handle the process?
Well, again, that's a problem today. And in fact, there's nothing to indicate that there'd be more lawsuits or more delays. Let me give you an example. 2000 election. Okay, the most famous election in U.S. history, we had delays because it was hard to know who won Florida.
The hanging chads.
Right, okay? You had tons of litigation, went to the Supreme Court. If you had had a national popular vote, it wouldn't have mattered. Al Gore won the national election regardless of who won Florida. So the Florida outcome would have been irrelevant, and we would not have had to wait a month to find out who was president.
As long as no other states had lawsuits filed against them.
But we wouldn't have, because my point is the national popular tally in 2000 was 3 million votes. No one disputed that we knew who won the national popular vote. We just didn't know who won a couple of states because they were really close. So you had recounts only because you had close elections in a few states, even though the national election. Same thing is true in 2004.
So in a close vote, the lawsuits would be potential.
If you have a close national vote.
Yes.
Yes.
That's
Yes.
where the concern would lie.
Yes.
that I
But the
was
flip side
addressing.
is, if you have a close state vote, but not a close national vote, as in 2000, it cuts the other way. As I say, in 2000, we had litigation because we didn't have a national popular vote system. You could imagine a situation where you have a nationally close election and you have litigation because you do have a national close outcome. So it's like all these things. It's not going to be worse under either regime.
So really what we're talking about here in the national popular vote versus the Electoral College, would this system result in fewer abnormalities in the outcome of the presidential election? Do you see that that would reduce the abnormalities overall in the presidential election?
It certainly could reduce them, because it would move towards most likely move towards a national ballot. A lot of the abnormalities and the litigation that we see is a function of different states and different counties using different ballots with different machines, chads, and marking things. So the whole Florida debacle arose because Florida had such weird ballots. Remember the butterfly ballot and the dimpled and hanging chads? If you have a national popular vote, you will most likely need a national ballot form. And once you have a national ballot form with the same machines in all the states counting them, you'll actually likely have far fewer abnormalities and fewer shenanigans in particular local places. Some folks are concerned that if you have a national popular election, that you will end up having more third-party candidates, and that the winner of the presidency will end up not having 50% or close to 50% of the popular vote. You'll have so-called plurality winners of the White House. History and logic don't really suggest that that would be the case. If you look at the largest states, California, Texas, and New York, they're mini countries of their own in a lot of ways. California has as many people as the United States as a whole did until the Civil War.
Yes.
And if you look at the way gubernatorial elections run in those states, you don't have a problem with third-party candidates and governors winning the state house with only 40% of the vote. In fact, you have more third-party candidates in presidential elections than you do governor elections. So if you end up making presidential elections look more like gubernatorial elections, there's no reason to think that you're going to increase third-party candidates if you think they're a problem. I mean, some people don't even think that's a bad thing, but some people do think it's a bad thing. But I think it's just a bit of a red herring. It's not. But it's an argument that's made, so I want to at least put it on the table. Here's the other thing to know, and this is a really important point. The states that have joined the National Popular Vote Compact right now are all Democratic Party states. They're all blue states. Okay? And you say, well, why is that? And the reason is that because the 2 times in the last 16 years that you've had inversion, by which I mean the person who wins the Electoral College being the person who lost the national popular vote, both times it was a Republican who won the Electoral College and lost the national popular vote. George Bush, Donald Trump. Okay? So people have it in their minds, hey, Electoral College helps the Republican Party and hurts the Democratic Party. So red state legislatures are reluctant to embrace the national popular vote, even though places like Texas, which are deeply red, are dissed by the Electoral College because candidates don't pay any attention to them. In fact, the Electoral College has hurt Republicans vis-a-vis Democrats over the last 12 years. Nate Silver, the famous statistician, has kind of documented that. Take the election of 2004, for example. In 2004, George Bush beat John Kerry nationally pretty well by about 3 million votes.
Correct.
But if John Kerry had just gotten a few more thousand votes in Ohio, if the weather had been a little better in Ohio, John Kerry may have won Ohio and won the Electoral College, even though he would have lost the national election by millions of votes. So we are at a moment in U.S. history where the Electoral College doesn't help or hurt either party. And that's a rare thing. So that's what creates an opportunity for people to really look at this issue on the merits without regard to partisan implications.
I think a more likely scenario, honestly, is that we would see the breakdown of the political parties, and in the sense of having 2 major political parties. I would expect a situation more like France, where they have 5, 6, 10 candidates every
Yes.
presidential election year, which sounds great because we all want to vote for who we want to vote for.
Yes.
The problem is, in France, you also end up in a situation where you have a runoff between, sometimes, it could be two kind of extremist French parties, or at least positions, or maybe there's an incumbent and then a socialist, or these kinds of things happen in Europe. This is normal for some countries. And so I kind of think in America, we're pretty independent-minded people, and if we're given the opportunity to fracture our vote, we will. And that sounds great to the extent that you want to vote how you want to vote and be independent and all that sort of stuff. But I think if you want to see the counter argument, what you do is you look to the 2016 Republican primaries and how that turned out. And I'm not talking about people, just to be clear, I'm talking about the process. The process was fractured. The process was divided. No candidate had any incentive to work with any other candidate to build a coalition. Because why should they? Because if you get 19% and that's better than their 18%, good for you. I win. Who cares? And what ended up happening, I think we're reaping the consequences of that right now. It's divided. It's fractured. People are angry at each other. What I would argue is that we don't need a presidential election system that divides and fractures us more. We're already pretty independent-minded, left to our own devices. We need a presidential election process like the Electoral College that brings us together, that forces us to focus on what are our similarities, what are the things that we agree on, what are the things that that we cherish as Americans, what are American principles. Now, the presidential candidates who have done the very best job of that, Ronald Reagan and FDR,
Yes.
won in massive landslides because they knew how to do that. They knew how to reach in and bring out what brings us together. And
Coalition building.
Coalition building. And, it's kind of a mess right now. And again, that's not a statement of people, it's a statement on process. But I would urge us to reconsider getting rid of the Electoral College to try to solve these problems. And what I would say instead is, let's look at our primary process, because our primary processes have been deteriorating over time, and they're no longer feeding well into this Electoral College system. And so the Electoral College over time has always been a coalition building device. That is why it has been good for us as a country, and I would hate to get rid of it.
Historically, if you look back at the Electoral College and the outcome of the vote
Compared to that,
people can't really determine
it'd be hard.
how anything has ever gone, because it's changed so significantly
And
each decade.
It's changed, and here I double back to the point I made that President Trump rightly makes. You never know what the popular vote would have looked like if the rules in place had been different at the beginning of the campaign, where the national popular vote winner was the person who was guaranteed to win the presidency. So when we look at national popular vote outcomes, we always have to look with them a little bit skeptically, because we don't know what they would have been if the rules had been different.
I think I would mostly urge people not to get too discouraged by 2016. And again, I'm talking about the process and the divisiveness and everything that came out of that. I would urge everyone to take more time to learn about the system. I think the things that went wrong in 2016 had a lot to do with the primaries and our nominee selection process, and not the Electoral College itself. I'm a little worried that there will be a kind of reflex reaction to get rid of something.
Yes.
And the Electoral College seems like the obvious candidate. But in reality, the Electoral College is one of the last few kind of marks of sanity in a presidential election system that is falling apart in other ways. And so I think the best way to go forward at this point is to look and see how we can make the primaries more coalition building like the Electoral College itself is. And in the primaries, there's a bigger emphasis on figuring out who is going to be a coalition building figure later. I think we used to do that, but the primaries have gotten more and more purely democratic over time, with just a more and more emphasis on populism and that kind of feeling. And so, again, there's a place for democracy, small d. I'm not trying to get rid of it. But the founders blended it. They blended it with republicanism and federalism. And so our primaries should do the same. And then they will be much more coalition building and will feed better into this Electoral College process that has served us so well for so long.
The most debated issue of national popular vote surrounds the issue of a need of a constitutional amendment. Those in favor of the current Electoral College process believe that the Constitution was not drafted in a manner that allows electors to change their voting process based on votes that were cast outside the state they represent. Those that support the national popular vote disagree. They believe the Constitution allows the electors from each state to choose the presidential candidate in any fashion they want. They believe that a constitutional amendment is not necessary, and they would be successful in enforcing this position. So will the compact process be challenged in the U.S. Supreme Court? And if it is challenged, will that challenge come early enough in the election cycle so the next presidential election process will not be hanging in limbo? Thank you for watching.